So for this morning's first discussion, as I said, the topic is the theme of competition, driving productivity, innovation and growth. And I really couldn't think of a better panel to join us for this conversation. We have the benefit of a number of different perspectives from some of the leading practitioners in the competition world. And I'm sure you'll all join me in showing a warm round of applause for our first panel. We are joined by Andreas Mundt, who absolutely needs no further introduction for this morning, by Andrea Marván, Chair of COFECE in Mexico, by Doris Tshepe, Commissioner from the South African Competition Commission, and by Guillaume Loriot, who's joining us from DG Comp and very kindly stepping in the place of Olivier Gasson, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but we are very, very grateful, Guillaume, for you joining us today. So thank you very much, and I'll come and take a seat. So today's discussion, I think, is going to be a real opportunity to bring some of these themes together and really explore some different perspectives from different agencies, different jurisdictions. A couple of quick words from a UK perspective before we get going. And you've heard a number of these themes already from the Minister, who talked about the importance of economic growth for the UK economy and the important role that competition agencies can play in supporting and driving that economic growth. And that's critically important because we know that economic growth helps investment in critical public services. It helps drive prosperity across the whole of our economies. Now in the UK, at the CMA, we've been thinking really deeply and carefully about how, as a competition authority, we can contribute to that government mission. And we know, and I think we'll hear a lot of discussion this morning, about how competition, how open, competitive markets really are the engine, the powerhouse of economic growth. They help drive greater productivity, they spur innovation. But what can we do specifically as competition agencies? What should our areas of focus be? What should our priority choices be? We've been thinking a lot in the UK about how we can help open up markets in those priority strategic sectors that the Minister mentioned. We've been thinking about how we can use competition as an advocacy tool, helping inform the government's industrial strategy, how we can intervene directly, in some cases by using competition to really open up markets, but perhaps in other cases, using competition policy as a flex, other areas where actually the best thing that we can do is encourage greater cooperation between businesses to really drive forward initiatives that will bring on greater investment, greater innovation, and more opportunities for growth. And we've also been thinking very, very carefully about how the CMA goes about our work and the impact that that can have on the UK economy. Now we know for the UK economy to grow, it needs to be an attractive destination for international investment. We know that the UK needs to be perceived as a great place to do business and to invest. And we know that the regulatory climate, the regulatory landscape is an important feature of that. And our role as a competition authority is important in setting that tone. So we've been really thinking very carefully about how we, as a competition agency, go about our work and how that can affect the attractiveness of the UK as a destination for business investment and business opportunity. Now, to be absolutely clear, and I think you heard this very clearly from the Minister already this morning, this is in no sense stepping away from those fundamental priorities of promoting competition and protecting consumers. That's our mandate, that's at the heart of the work that we do. But how we go about that work, I think, can make a real difference. So we have introduced in the UK a programme of, I think, really quite ambitious change, which we've framed around what are now referred to quite commonly as our 4 Ps, 4 key principles around pace. How quickly can we deliver the outcomes that we are seeking to achieve through our work? Proportionality, are we making sure that the interventions that we design are proportionate and don't have unintended consequences? Predictability, I think, is absolutely key for business investment, for certainty for businesses. Do they know what to expect from our processes? Do they know how to engage with us? Are they clear what outcome we're seeking to achieve? And finally, process, how we are engaging with businesses, with investors, with other stakeholders to make sure that as much as possible, this is a journey that we go on together. And I think we're seeing that transformation coming through now. We've pursued a program of change, applying this 4Ps framework to our mergers work, to our digital markets work, our consumer protection work. It's an important part of our mandate in the UK as well. But having spent a lot of time over the last few months thinking carefully and deeply about that from a UK perspective, I am absolutely fascinated to hear the international perspective. So without further ado, we'll open up our first panel. And we're going to start with the big picture question. How can competition policy help contribute to those headline economic goals in terms of driving greater productivity, innovation, growth, or other broad economic goals that your governments are seeking to achieve? And I know there's been a huge amount of discussion, obviously, in the EU about competitiveness. We've had the Draghi report. So I wonder whether, Guillaume, we can just start with your perspective from the EU lens. How are you thinking about the role of competition policy in supporting growth and competitiveness?
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me and not instead of Olivier. That's I feel that this is a privilege.
There's always a competitive benefit.
So I'll try to contribute as much as I can, and I'm sure Olivier would have loved to be here today and that we aligned on the message we want to give on this very important topic. I think, as you underlined it, in the EU, but I believe in all jurisdictions, the matter of productivity and competitiveness is central in economic policies. In the EU, it's been obviously the Draghi report driving the conversations and the political agenda because of the perceived lack of or decline in productivity in many sectors. The report is more nuanced. It depends on the sectors, and the big gap is about tech and the train that you missed on tech innovation some years ago. In other sectors, actually, the picture is not as bad. That being said, I think the matter has been a central for the agenda of the European Commission, because indeed innovation, energy efficiency, sustainability, but also security and resilience are now priorities and should be well beyond the competition policy agenda. So what should be the role of competition indeed in, should it contribute? To what extent should it be driving the discussion? I think there are many questions that we all ask ourselves, and that indeed very important. I'll try to give you a picture on the dimensions that I see very relevant for us in steering the discussions. But I think there's one very important caveat, at least one thing that we need to flag all of us up front when we have this conversation. I think this discussion about productivity and investment is indeed very important, but it shouldn't be, it shouldn't distract us from talking about price competition. That is also essential. It matters. It matters for citizens. It matters for businesses. I think Andreas referred to work, being done by the ICN on the competition in food supply chains. I think that matters not only for some jurisdictions, but for all jurisdictions. We see that in European merger control. We had important cases where we saw bottlenecks in these industries, and price competition is important. It's also important in telecoms. So I think the big trap for us is not to think that now investment is a more important priority than price competition. It all goes together, and we should balance that out. In practice, it may be difficult how to balance, short-term benefits versus long-term benefits, but that's the discussion that we should focus on. Now, I don't want to avoid the topic. I think the topic for me has three essential dimensions. It could be a very long debate, but I want to focus on 3 points. First is the issue about international competitiveness, because every jurisdiction or politicians, it's normal, are nervous about, their countries being less competitive. That's very normal. So what's the role of competition there? The second is about innovation, investment. What is the role of competition? What should we also take as a lesson in this debate? And the third issue is a bit more tricky, is about resilience and about security. Now, I don't think I want to cover, I don't have an hour, I have a few minutes. I just want to highlight maybe for the discussion on these 3 points, the big topics. On international competitiveness, I think the good news, and that's what I read in the Draghi report, is that for a very long time, there was the opposition between industrial policy and competition. Those opposing a strong competition policy were saying industrial policy needs to take priority. Well, I think the big message now is to say, well, there's no competitiveness without competition, so what you need, a real industrial policy, an efficient one, is one that is pro-competitive. So that you need to steer that industrial policy to make sure that, it's not picking the winners, it's not about national champions, and I think the Draghi report says it very explicitly. It's about making sure that you have a competitive economy and a competitive industrial policy. The second point on competitiveness is this debate about scale versus competition. And that's a very important debate, because sometimes there are some that tend to oppose competition with the need for scale in some areas. Obviously, there are several dimensions to the debate. Is it competition that drives scales? Do you become big because you are competitive, or is it the other way around? Are you big and then competitive? I tend to have the view that you become big by being competitive, so that you need that competition to be steered. But obviously that is something that is important. In the review of our guidelines in mergers, we will have this debate about the interaction between scale and competitiveness, and that will be, something that will be steering the discussion. And in that sense, merger control is obviously at the center of the debate when you oppose scale and competition. And what I always try to, remind everyone is that, merger control is not about scale as such. We've gone away from the big is bad. You might have conglomerates and no market power. I think the issue is about market power, whatever the scale actually. Those markets where you see excessive market power, you need to intervene. That is essential. So the debate has been a bit steered in a way where you would oppose competition and scale, and we should not fall, I think, into that perception. Now, I could develop a bit more, but obviously competition is part of the wider economic policy. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's also one piece of the puzzle. And so, when there are discussions, for example, about market integration in Europe, we also say, well, please first remove the hurdles between our countries that are amount in fact to tariffs, if you see the IMF report, and there you can have both scale and pro-competitive scale without diminishing competition. Then very quickly, the two other topics are innovation and resilience. I don't know if I have 1 minute.
Go for it, 1 minute.
On innovation, I think just a highlight, obviously, there's the discussion, and I think also coming from the discussion from the Draghi report about how competition is driving innovation. For example, in mergers, some mergers drive innovation. We've always been vigilant. I think we welcome the fact that we now are called to look at innovation effects, even though there's more uncertainty, it's a longer time frame. Actually, I think all competition authorities have done that and have called for that dimension of competition to be taken into account. So that's good news. I think that's good news. We should take it as something where we need to be more, where we need to be proactive despite the challenges. And there's obviously the debate, which is the other side of the coin, the innovation defense, the efficiency defense, and that's something we will engage into. And third, but that's also an important part, is the debate about resilience. Here again, is competition a problem for the resilience? We believe that not. I think resilience is inherent to competition. You are more resilient if you have various sources of input and supplies. You're more resilient if your companies are competitive because they are used to compete at home and to adapt and innovate. So I think there's that debate whether it should be an additional benchmark for competition assessment. I think that's something we will need to tackle, but we should see that we have a good story to tell about also this priority that goes beyond competition, but where competition can contribute. And I think I will stop there because I've been too long already.
No, that's perfect. I think you're already well demonstrating how we could actually devote an entire conference simply to this topic, and I'm sure we will return to it. But I think super helpful sketching out those different interactions and just the richness and the complexity of these issues. They're not simple and straightforward ones, but I think absolutely ones we can have a really good discussion about. Andreas, from your perspective, how do you see competition policy contributing to those broader economic goals?
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, I would like to mention, I think, in a way, this debate is going into a somewhat wrong direction. Because if you read about Europe and Germany, what do we need to improve the economic framework in order to do better? What you read about? Do you read much about competition policy in Europe to improve the economic framework? No. If you look at Germany, we need a corporate tax reform, desperately. We read about bureaucracy, that bureaucracy is overwhelming, cannot be handled anymore by companies in certain sectors that is strangling the industry in a certain way. You read about energy prices. Investment, long-term investment needs reliable and long-term cheap energy. This is what you read about. You read about education. We need well-educated workers. We need well-educated employees, but you do not read very much about competition policy. You read about infrastructure. In Germany, you read a lot about infrastructure. Digital infrastructure on the one side, physical infrastructure on the other side. We have not invested enough in our physical infrastructure. We have bridges that are barred for the time being, which cannot be crossed by heavy trucks anymore. So, and then we talk a little bit about competition policy. Of course, this does not mean that we as competition agencies or competition policy cannot contribute to growth. But what I think is, at first point, most important is consequent enforcement. And I think by doing this, we best contribute to growth and competitiveness. We have gone through some phases of structural change. We have gone through some phases of crisis. Think of COVID, think of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, think of the financial crisis. And during all this time, we have always made clear, also within the ICN, that competition is part of the solution. It is definitely not a part of the problem. And in a way, we have managed to carry competition through all these crises very successfully. For Europe, you can read this in the recent EU report, Protecting Competition in a Changing World. And we see here that in Europe, we have, not by far, but we have much less concentrated markets in Europe than we have in the US, which, by the way, I think is very good. I also echo what Loriot has said about the size of companies. We are not against European champions. I think we need European champions. They are very important. They are clusters of skills, of investment, and all of this. And I never ever saw that competition agencies stand in the way of national champions, but competition fosters them. Champions do not grow because they receive subsidies, but they don't grow on the basis of state intervention. They grow because they are competitive, because they do better than their competitors. Last but not least, how can we contribute in practice? I think we can contribute to swift investment because investors like reliable and predictable authorities. So besides consequent enforcement, to uphold competition principles and keep markets open, we can contribute through transparent, reliable, predictable, and fast enforcement. Just to give you an example, in Germany, a first phase case, on average, takes 21 days. Investors like that. You know, they give us a phone. How long does it take? We say if it's easy, it's not longer definitely than a month, but we can do it quicker. Sometimes if you urgently need a decision, you get a decision within a week. Sometimes you even get it within 3 days. That happens if we see immediately that there's nothing behind these mergers. And I think this is what matters very much for investment, that you have a reliable authority and that you have a transparent authority that gives you predictability and legal certainty. And by the way, I echo everything that Loriot has said here, Guillaume has said here. This is what matters, and as I said, swift enforcement, consequent enforcement is the best thing we can do. So in a nutshell, we have done our homework until today, and I expect now others to do their homework. But of course, to take care for infrastructure, education, all these things, That is hard to do, and it's much harder than just to do a little bit change in the area of merger control and relax merger regulation, but this is not the way forward.
Thanks, Andreas. And it's really interesting. I think we're all sort of grappling at the moment as antitrust agencies. What is our role in those broader debates? You know, is enforcement the priority? It's absolutely a key part of it. Do we have a responsibility also to shape that wider discussion? When you call out infrastructure, I think it is a great example of an area which I'm sure across many economies there is a need for greater investment. What is the role for the competition agency in helping to shape some of those markets as a priority sector that we've been thinking about in the UK? And I know in Mexico you've been thinking quite a bit about those strategic priorities, how to play that sort of advocacy role, that enforcement role. Perhaps, Andrea, if you can give us a bit more of your perspective and your thinking in that space.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Good morning to everyone. And actually this is a topic that actually you and I have been discussing recurrently. I must say, I agree with Andreas. I think our role as competition agency is to have swift, fast, and very strategic enforcement, but I think we are also missing a piece or an important piece of the puzzle, which, as you just mentioned, is advocacy. Our role as competition agencies regarding advocacy, I think, can be key to see the big picture, to see how our government's industrial policy or our government's priorities have to work along, or they can make them see competition as an ally. Competition, as we were just mentioning, at its core, it's a public policy. But this public policy has to adapt and has to remain relevant in a changing economy and a changing world. And I think this also echoes what Andreas was just mentioning. I'm going to try and give a few examples of something that we've done to be a little bit more concrete that we've been working in COFECE. For example, our government has set one of its priorities to have more regional development, to develop certain regions where productivity thrives and to help the local economies grow. So what have we been doing in that aspect? Part of that aspect is usually accompanied by port development and more competition in ports. So we have been advising governments on port tenders in how to design competitive port tenders. Another example, which this is very interesting because it aligns business priorities and the government's priorities. Something I've mentioned earlier in these forums is the Mexican economy is different from European economies because more than 50% of our economies are informal economies. So there is a strong necessity to help formalize businesses, to help medium and small enterprises gain access to credit. So one of the initiatives that we are currently working with the business community, which actually, again, this is something that came from the business community, but aligns perfectly with the government's priorities, and it is competition, but I would say competition maybe on a broader sense, is what are the obstacles in our regulation that are impeding or making more complicated to become a formal business. So what we did is we analyzed a huge amount, I don't know the exact number, but a huge amount of federal and local regulation to see where are these barriers and where are there maybe double or triple or I don't know, so many permits and governmental barriers that are impeding businesses to make it easier for them to become a formal business. We are in the final stage of doing this work. We have been working with, as I mentioned, the business community, but also with the government, and there has been a lot of interest related to this initiative. And then also to give, I think, another quick example, also related to regional development, something that we've done as an advocacy tool and has been resulted very successful, I would say, is an initiative to bring competition to the local governments and to state governments. So we have been working particularly with different states in Mexico to see what their competition needs are, how is what are the competition issues that they are facing in each state within Mexico, and working on plans that go together with the business community, the academic community, and the state governments in order to help them face these challenges. So although I completely agree with Andreas that I think our main job is definitely fast, predictable, and enforcement, I do think that advocacy is also a key piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Andrea. It's really interesting, isn't it? I think it's a very common theme at the moment across so many jurisdictions. How can we play our part as competition agencies in helping government look at the wider regulatory landscape and sort of unlocking those barriers to innovation and growth as well? I think public procurement is another theme. I know we've got a session later this week where it's a really interesting example of an area where you can have hardcore competition problems and enforcement to address those, but also opportunities to really unlock. We've been looking a lot at what we call our sort of horizontal enablers that can really accelerate growth opportunities. Doris, from a South African perspective, how are you working with broader government policy to achieve some of those wider social and policy objectives and the role that competition policy and enforcement has to play in that?
Good morning, Sarah, and just thank you for inviting me to be here. It's absolutely lovely to be here, and congratulations on this beautiful conference together with the program. I think it's quite wonderful. And I think this conversation we having to have it in South Africa, and I think globally most competition authorities are being asked. And I think as governments increasingly are focusing on industrial investment policy to boost growth and competitiveness, given the current economic environment, there is pressure on all of us and all parts of government, for that matter, to contribute to an effort to economic growth. And this happens, as I say, it's because of the current economic environment, because generally in high growth, we're not having these conversations, we are allowed to move along. But I think in my view, competitive markets are essential to the industrialization and competitiveness agenda. And agencies are having to make this case, and we're finding in South Africa that this is something we're being asked more and more to remind governments that for you to have this agenda of industrialization and competitiveness, you do require competition and competitive markets, and that's a role we can play. As most of you are aware, the OECD released a report in 2024 on a pro-competitive industrial policy, and this is founded on academic work showing that successful industrial policy is where competition is supported, as this enhances competitiveness through productivity growth. And the Drudge report that everyone has been talking about cites similar research. So to be responsive to this agenda, I think competition enforcement needs to be more focused on the targeted industrial sectors, on rapidly, and I think everyone has raised this, rapidly removing barriers to entry and expansion to boost investment and innovation, and advocating for pro-competitive industrial policy or broader reforms. And I think for us in South Africa, we've recognized that agencies, as an agency, we need to be operating a little differently to how we have been in order to remain relevant. And three issues for me will come about. We've had the need to be more focused on pro-competitive interventions and be forward-looking to look at new sectors to ensure that they are shaped more pro-competitively. And this includes removal of regulatory barriers to businesses. And here I think the next one is agility, and I think this was discussed. Agencies will need to be more focused and respond more rapidly to remain relevant in a more dynamic technological and global economy. And third, I think agencies, we're finding this more and more, and you raised this earlier, Sarah, that we need to be working far more closely and collaboratively with other parts of government to ensure that all the tools that are available that we can use to achieve similar objectives, and that what would be our role there. And so aside from these prioritization, obviously, and agility points, there are ways to incorporate, and South Africa has been a case in point here, to incorporate broader economic goals into competition law more formally. And we've seen this in our country where while we refer to this more broadly as public interest provisions, they mostly speak to broader economic objectives and can explicitly be included in decision making, as we've seen in our law. For instance, in South Africa, as you mostly know, we have included in major control consideration the ability of national industries to compete in international markets and the development of a particular sector or region in a major control, and this is in the law. In other African countries have similar developmental objectives in their laws. We also in South Africa have provision around participation and expansion of small and medium enterprises, which we see as essential for developing a more dynamic and innovative market through ensuring a healthy ecosystem for firm entry and expansion. In my view, just lastly to say, this formal inclusion allows for a more evidence-based approach with clear and transparent principles set out in competition law rather than through some lobbying of politicians in that way, and that is how we are doing it in South Africa. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Doris. There is so much I think that we could easily explore further along these themes, because I think that whole theme of how you integrate or don't the consideration of sort of pure competition factors with broader policy goals, as you say, that's to ensure that that's done in a way that is clear and is predictable, but enables us as competition authorities to take account of that wider set of factors where it's relevant, or for the government to be able to do that or work alongside us to do that. And I think that is just a theme, certainly from a UK perspective, that we're seeing increasing prominence and relevance, and one that I think as an international community it's really helpful for us to learn from one another, because there are a number of slightly different approaches. And I think it goes back, Guillaume, to a lot of your themes around, sometimes this isn't as binary as big is bad, or competition at all costs. It's about making sure that you've got the right competitive foundations that can build that capability, can build those regional opportunities, those national opportunities, can develop scale. Scale isn't a problem per se for competition, but it needs to be developed in a marketplace where there's still enough competitive pressure to bring those benefits through to customers and businesses. We've got about 10 minutes or so left, so what I might do is just do another tour around, and perhaps we've talked at that broader level around the role of competition policy working alongside wider government and social objectives, but perhaps if you can just give us a couple of examples in your different jurisdictions, either of a specific piece of work that you've been prioritising recently that gives us a good illustration of that. I know, for example, in South Africa and Mexico, as in the UK, we use our markets tools quite a bit in this space alongside formal enforcement work, but also perhaps unpack a little bit some more of those examples about how you might have been thinking about how we go about our work. We've talked, all of us, I think, a lot about greater pace, greater predictability. What concretely and tangibly you think about doing differently to achieve that? And maybe Doris, if we can start with you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think, as I said, we have reprioritized our work in South Africa. First, we are collaborating across government to use our tools alongside other government efforts to rapidly unblock barriers to growth and industrialization, and to reduce cost of living. And I know you spoke about this earlier in your introduction. We have been using block exemptions to allow pro-growth collaboration among business on fixing, as most of you would know, we've had a significant energy crisis in South Africa. We've used block exemption as a mechanism to deal with this, with energy availability in the country. We've used block exemption also in relation to infrastructure, to logistics barriers in the economy. We are planning on another block exemption to facilitate export infrastructure and market intelligence collaboration among businesses. The other issue that we're doing, and it's an advocacy work, it's on cost of living. we are collaborating with the Department of Agriculture on essential foods. As you know, the cost of living has meant that essential food, particularly for the poor, has been almost unaffordable. We are collaborating also on cost of living with the Department of Communication on digital infrastructure and costs of telcos, and you've dealt with that a little earlier. And the next other collaboration is with the Department of Health on health care costs in South Africa, and this we're using under the banner of cost of living and through advocacy work that we are doing. Second, we are looking at ways to be more agile, to fast-track investigation and deliver outcomes quicker. We have proposed to the government an increase in measure threshold to avoid holding up smaller measures that typically raises limited issues, and have committed to fast-tracking investigations, particularly those that may bring about foreign direct investment into the country. We've also been looking at substantially reducing timelines for conduct cases that remove barriers to entry in the country. We are also looking, particularly in digital markets, at using market inquiries to look at those, because for us it takes longer in dealing with enforcement cases. We are faced with issues of jurisdiction by these larger tech firms, so we use market inquiries as a mechanism to try and deal with those issues. So those are the three areas in our mind where we're trying to use this to try and look at how we can collaborate more broadly in dealing with broader economic policies. Thank you, Sarah.
Doris, thank you. And Andrea, how about your experience in Mexico?
Yes, thank you. I think I would like to make, I would say, two very fast points. So first of all, we are focusing, as Doris just mentioned, in areas that I prioritize, or sectors that are priority. So we are doing ongoing on an enforcement side. We do have ongoing scrutiny on agri-food sector. So we do have market investigations. We have an ongoing market investigation that is very focused on agri-food sector. Also, we are constantly monitoring the financial sector. We conducted a market investigation related to card payment systems. In there, we not only ordered some remedies to the businesses in order to ensure that there's governance and that the risks of any collusion or abuse of dominance are eliminated, but we mainly focused on the regulatory barriers and the regulatory problems that are that rise due to a regulation that was designed decades ago, and it's not responding to the reality. So right now we are working very closely with the financial regulators and with the Ministry of Finance in order to implement these to change these regulations and to modernize it in order to help thrive more financial inclusiveness. And then a third sector that we're focusing is also in logistic-related sectors. So these are very transversal sectors, such as railroads and land transportation. We currently have we have two market investigations. One is related to freight railroad transportation, and we also have another market investigation which is related to to passenger transportation. And in these two also investigations, the regulators have been key in order to provide us key information, key data, and etc., in order to analyze and find some of our findings. I would just like to close with, I think, a broader perspective. So what can we do, or what are the results? There's a recent study that was conducted by the World Bank, which found that COFECE has investigated about 40% of all industries in Mexico. And what's interesting is this study has found that there has been a 3% increase in wages and also an increase in job creation in these interventions. So I think that's when you make the benefits of our intervention or enforcement much more tangible. Also, the study concludes that there has been a notable boost in productivity with increases in output and sales, largely driven by the elimination of anti-competitive practices. I think that's where you can see how these interventions have to be strategic, but how enforcement, and this is again seconding what Andreas has been saying, how enforcement can actually make change an industry or contribute into more productivity, more innovation, better wages, better jobs, etc. Thank you.
It's so important. I know, again, at the CMA, we've been thinking a lot about how do we measure the impact of our work. I'm sure, again, that's another really rich common theme for a future discussion, because as we were talking earlier, at the end of the day, as competition authorities, we serve an end purpose, which is to contribute better market outcomes in our various economies. And how do we measure that impact, I think, is so prescient for us at the moment. Andreas, I know we've heard a lot about the importance of continuing with that mainstay, that focus on enforcement, but are there other areas which the Bundeskartellamt has been prioritising with this sort of broader lens of the benefits of trying to drive growth and investment productivity?
Yeah, I mean, the Bundeskartellamt does not so much put sectoral priorities. We have never been known for that. What we try is that we get a good mix of applying traditional tools and new tools that we have received in recent years. One traditional tool that we really try to apply as much as possible is cartel enforcement. I mean, nobody talks about cartel enforcement these days anymore. There is no conference where you have any plenary session about cartel enforcement, but I think it still is extremely important because it is at the heart of the legitimacy of our work, and it remains a betrayal to consumers and others. So we try to keep that up as successful as possible, and I think we get some good success here. Second point, I think what is more needed than ever is merger control. Merger control is so important because we see these highly concentrated markets, and because we see all these strategies, new strategies that are so hard to tackle with traditional merger control regulation. Most of the regimes are turnover oriented. We see in many markets that we do not catch the mergers that we should, maybe to a certain extent. We see killer acquisitions, we see acqui-hire, we see all of this. By the way, not only in digital markets, we also see that in pharma markets. We see that at least in Germany in the event industry. We see it in advertising. So to find a good solution for this, we in Germany thought it might be the transactive value threshold. I'm not so sure today if I look at what the courts made out of the transaction value threshold. So we must look at this. I envy you, by the way, a little bit for your call-in system sometimes. I think maybe this is kind of a better way forward. I also mentioned new tools. We make use, of course, and that is maybe a strategic decision of Section 19A with regard to digital markets. I think there still remains a lot to do in very close cooperation with the European Commission. Not only there, by the way, also with our sister authorities within Europe. I think that is kind of a joint approach that we are taking in Europe to get our work done on these digital markets. So if you want, that was a decision, a strategic decision to look very closely at these kind of markets. But last not least, we also, I think we're the only competition agency within the EU that has this new competition tool. The new competition tool is about reinstalling competition in industries where you have no infringement of competition law maybe, but where you see that competition is dampened, hampered by the structure of the market, by other areas, and then by other measures, and then we can take up all measures, all instruments in order to reinstall competition here. We have we have introduced our first case in this area. It's on the fuel wholesale market, a very important market, goes also always to the heart of the consumers, fuel prices. So that was also in a way a strategic decision that we tried to apply this new competition tool and see what we might be able to do in this market. And maybe two other points, just to mention them quickly. Advocacy, I fully agree, Andrea, is more important than ever in this debate about growth, competitiveness. All of this, I think, this really matters. And maybe to conclude, one point that really goes to my heart is to avoid, and that is also part of the advocacy strategy, a future politicization of competition law. Personally, I do not believe that it is a good idea that competition agencies look at something else than competition, because this is our turf. This is what we know how to do. And there are many other areas that in the very end are political decisions, and they should not be moved to competition agencies, because that also might go to the detriment of our independence if you mingle with that. And in most cases, to be frank, that is the experience in Germany. It was not very good to put competition aside and take a political decision. You know, we have these ministerial authorizations in Germany, and if you look at them one by one, to put it with your queen, your former queen, it will be very difficult to find a good case where competition has been overruled and where you have seen in a merger a decision by the ministry based on other political reasoning than competition. The result you wanted to achieve never turned out. And so I think that is very important, because we live in this politicized world now, and to get this away from our decision-making process, from our decisions, to me that is of utmost importance.
Thanks, Andreas. And it's certainly super helpful, I think, to have the clarity about where the responsibility sits in different jurisdictions. I think it operates in slightly different ways, but I think the critical feature is that clarity of who takes which decisions on what basis. But Guillaume, perhaps a couple of just final reflections from you from an EU perspective. I think any sort of particular initiatives that you're focusing on, areas of review, and also I think perhaps a reflection from the European Commission in terms of the role of cooperation amongst different agencies in focusing on some of these issues.
So maybe on your first question about, you know, what are the areas of work where we see our contribution on this debate. And obviously you have, I mean, there are four points that I just want to mention. First, there's a specificity in the EU, obviously, that our commissioner, who has a broad portfolio, is also in charge of state aid control. And state aid control has been instrumental in the debate now about, you know, energy autonomy, energy affordability, sustainability. All of that goes together with competitiveness, and that's a good thing. And to steer that debate and to, you know, steer public investment in a way that is pro-competitive. Her role in, you know, in the clean industrial deal, in having, you know, state aid control steered in a way that is pro-competitive is one very important part of our work. I know it's specific, it's beyond like the ICN remit, but that is the reality as far as we're concerned. The second point is a point that Andreas mentioned, is a good illustration of how competition can inform pro-competitive regulation or pro-competitive new tools. We had this experience in other network industries. You know, when I hear about the DMA, there are other areas where competition has informed pro-competitive regulation, energy, you know, regulations, telecom regulations, you know, to name just a few, and obviously the DMA, which is also a very important illustration of how, you know, facts-based and evidence can inform a form of regulation, asymmetric regulation, but regulation. Third point is antitrust. We are, you know, under a review of our Regulation 1, and we have in mind, you know, the need for antitrust, which is, I think, more relevant than ever, because it's a way to detect new issues that are not covered by regulations or new tools. And we want to make that even more agile, more adapted to the realities, to have due process, which is essential, which is essential, and the specificity and strength of competition enforcement, but also has to be adapted to the need for speed and agility. The fourth one is merger control. Very important debate indeed on how merger control should adapt, but within which limits. We will be launching a review of our merger guidelines, not only the horizontal merger guidelines, but the vertical ones. It will be a very important debate on many counts, including those we've been discussing today, but in particular on the role of innovation in many respects, not only tech, digital tech, but clean tech, green tech, which are essentials for our economies and for our competitiveness. It is not only, but it is also a debate about sustainability, but it's a debate about how we can make our economies more competitive, more resilient, and more affordable. So that's also part of the discussion, but within the boundaries of what merger control should deal with. And that will be a very extensive debate. And I think the last point, which is really relevant obviously for us today, and that's the second part of your question, what do we see as very important? I think more than ever, cooperation is fundamental. We have, as competition authorities, a very fundamental advantage that we sometimes forget. We do investigations, we know markets. We need to take that information and inform, decision makers on what the realities are. And that is our strength. And I think when this morning you mentioned the role of the ICN, we learn from each other. Not only that, we have papers, we have topics on various relevant issues, but we also take ownership all together of these stories, and I think that makes us very influential, especially in those debates where there is pressure from all parts. We have the example of the ECN, which is obviously a very special animal because we all apply the same law, and we all take ownership, commission, national authorities of EU law, and that makes us very strong. And I think that's a very good example on how cooperation is in fact the way forward when you have cross-cutting issues being raised by decision makers. Fine, but we need to address them, at least have a mutual understanding on what we should be doing, what we should be enforcing, and to tell the decision makers that actually other jurisdictions also do that. And that is our fundamental strength, and I think that's why the ICN is so relevant as well.
Thank you, Guillaume. What a great note to end on. And I think this has been a fascinating conversation and actually really enlightening for me. As I said at the very outset, we've been thinking a lot about this from a UK perspective, but it's so interesting to hear so much commonality in terms of the ways different jurisdictions are thinking about similar issues and those opportunities to really learn from one another and cooperate going forward as we tackle these challenges together. So I'm sure will continue to be a rich discussion for the ICN going forward. In the spirit of pace and agility, I will say that we have now time for a very short coffee break, which is, I think, back down on the lower floor. So please be at your most agile and your most dynamic and your most forward-looking, because we have an excellent panel discussion that is starting in just over 10 minutes. Please be back here for 10:40. Race your way to the coffee and the pastries. And thank you very much to the panel members for this first panel discussion.